In this presentation, I'm going to provide you with an introduction to human neuroanatomy that we'll be using throughout the course. And a lot of these structures, certainly they're particular to the human brain, but also generalized to other vertebrates. And so let's begin. What we're looking at is the MRI of a human head. You can almost make out the identity of the person. There's so much detail here. And let's begin by changing to our cutting tool and then just cutting in a little bit on the top of the head, just like that. And so I'm going to use my cutting blade as a pointer, the top tip. You can see the white rim here, that's the skull. And you can see these kind of granular structures. These are the covering of the brain, including the dura mater. And you can begin to see underneath what's described as the macaroni-like structure of the human cerebral cortex. And you can see these macaronis kind of winding around in here. If you look a little carefully at a single part of one of these bumps here, you can see that it's kind of whitish on the inside. This is the white matter, the axons of the neurons, and a little more clear or grayer on the outside, and this is where the neuronal cell bodies and the synapses are found. Let's cut in a little bit more, and as we cut through, you can notice that the vasculature is very well labeled. The person was injected with a contrast agent prior to conducting the scan. As we move down through the cortex, and we encounter a structure right here called the Corpus Callosum that links the left and the right hemispheres. Now, as I mention these names, these are the structures that I want you to know and be able to recognize. We'll cut in a little bit further, and you can see things kind of open up into what's called the ventricular space. These spaces are filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. And as we continue cutting, then we get into subcortical structures here, and then into a structure called the thalamus. As we keep going, then you can see a structure with some bumps, indeed 4 bumps here. Underneath the thalamus, this is what we call the midbrain, and you can really pick out the vasculature here. You can see how the cortex is wrapping around all of these internal core structures. Let's continue through the midbrain, and now we're in a structure that is called the pons. It's an integrative structure and motor control structure. We've now cut into another interesting part of the brain called the cerebellum. The cerebellum also has a cortical layering, but the individual lobes of the cerebellum are much finer and smaller. Let's keep going. Now we're back into what we call the medulla. So the pons and the medulla together are called the brainstem. And we keep cutting, keep cutting, keep cutting. And now the structure becomes a little more circular and heads down below the brain. And what we're looking at here is the top of the spinal cord. Now let's come in from the side, and we'll see a lot of these structures again in a very interesting way. So here we're coming in through the ear, and right here now you can see then the cortex completely wraps around these major structures of the brain, and you can see very clearly here's the white matter, and then above it is the gray matter. Now in about 1 millimeter cubed of gray matter, and I'm just kind of drawing, just about that big, and 1 millimeter deep, we would find about 100,000 neurons in all of their connections. Let's keep cutting. Now here we're cutting into the cerebellum, and you can see, we'll cut to about the midline here. You can see the cerebral cortex overlying all of these structures, and remember it was also lateral. But underneath is the cerebellum, and you can see the white matter of the cerebellum, the kind of fine structure. It has also a gray matter and outer layer also that is just loaded with synaptic structures. Although instead of maybe macaroni size, these are more like spaghetti-sized lobules. And then from the side, we can see the corpus callosum, this white matter bundle that links the left and the right hemispheres. Many of the neurons project their axons through here. You can kind of peek up into one of the lateral ventricles. Now here's the bumps of the midbrain. Up here is the thalamus, midbrain, pons with this kind of bulb right here. and then a little smaller bulb that we call the medulla. Again, the pons and medulla form the brainstem, and then the spinal cord coming out the bottom and extending through the length of the spine. You can see now up into the lateral ventricle here very clearly. Now we're going to repeat these operations, but this time I'll show you that some of the structures that we've been pointing to have actually been segmented out, and they'll appear as colored objects. So let's go ahead and cut in again, and you can see now we're cutting through the skull and we're cutting into the MRI on the left side, but on the right side you can see the bumps that we call gyri of the macaronis, the folded macaronis, and then the grooves between them that we call sulci are evident. And you can see that different gyri have different colors associated with them. So let's just go ahead and cut all the way through, and we'll pull our segmentation out, and then we'll turn it sideways, and now we're looking at the side of the brain. And so let's focus initially on the cortex, which of course is all over, covering most of the internal structures of the brain. The cortex is broken into 4 lobes by really geographic boundaries. There's a major sulcus, kind of like the Grand Canyon, that runs from the front here all the way back along the top of this yellow gyrus back to right here. And this region of cortex, it's in the orange and the maroon and the kind of mauve and the yellow, is what's called temporal cortex. You can put your finger on your temple kind of pointing into your head, and right inside there is where the temporal cortex will be. Now let's look at the back. This kind of beige region is what's called occipital cortex, and this is where we have primary and secondary and higher order visual cortices. As opposed to over here, we had auditory cortex, some aspects of speech perception, and even beginning speech production areas. Now, let's look at then, so we have occipital and temporal cortex. There's another major sulcus, another kind of Grand Canyon sulcus running from the midline down to the lateral sulcus. This is called the central sulcus. And the region of cortex between the central sulcus and these other cortices is called parietal cortex. Primary somatosensory cortex runs along this gyrus here, the pink ridge. Lots of integrative sensory areas and other higher functioning areas there. And then from the central sulcus going to the front is the largest lobe, the frontal lobe. Even though there are 4 lobes, this occupies about 1/3 of the cortical volume. And it's frontal cortex where the motor actions and then higher decision making, especially up toward the front, what we call prefrontal cortex, are located. Now let's look inside here, and you can see, we'll turn it this way. Remember the white matter that was running between the cortices, the corpus callosum? That's what we've outlined here. You can see smoothly where it's cut at the midline. Now under here we have then the thalamus, which is in here in beige. The thalamus is like Grand Central Station, descending motor and ascending sensory information, for the most part, all pass through there. Then we have the midbrain, and up here in the light blue and the dark blue there, and then the purple, those are the bumps on the top, and the purple down here, we have midbrain areas. Then we have the pons, remember that kind of bulbous area. Many of the cells in the pons are linked to the cerebellum above it. And you can see from the side that we have the cerebral cortex up here and the cerebellar cortex in humans kind of tucked underneath. And then where things are still a little bit bulbous, not as much, this is called the medulla. The pons and the medulla together are the brainstem. And then from the bottom of the medulla on out is the spinal cord, heading on down there. Now I've turned the brain, and we can look inside. You can see we're right at the midline. Recall the white matter tract that had many axons running between the left and the right sides. Here we've cut right through it, and this is called the corpus callosum. Here you can see that flat edge cut. If we look underneath in beige, this is an area called the thalamus. The thalamus is kind of a Grand Central Station, so descending projections from the cortex and ascending projections to the cortex, for the most part, pass through the thalamus. Underneath the thalamus is the midbrain, and in light blue and dark blue here are the 4 bumps, and underneath in red are the midbrain structures. And then remember that kind of bulbous process called the pons. Many cells there are linked to the cerebellum, which is here in lighter blue. And when we turn the brain back laterally, you can see the cerebellum in humans tucked up underneath the cerebral cortex. And you can see the thinner gyri of the cerebellar cortex. Now, behind the pons, another bulbous area, not quite as large as the medulla, so the pons and medulla together are what we call the brainstem, and then below the medulla is the extension, the top of the spinal cord, and the spinal cord then extends all the way along the spine. So feel free, explore, grab the data, cut it any way you like, and have some fun. In the setting menu in the software, and again I'll bring that up, and it's this setting symbol. If you come down here, there's a cut surfaces checkbox, and when that is on, then your cut plane cuts not only the MRI, but it also cuts the segmentation, and you can see what's inside of each segmentation, and that gives you quite a fabulous view of the actual raw data, and you can see how the segmentation was determined.